Goblins. Nasty little green fellas with a habit for mischief, murder and mayhem. Depending upon the presentation of Goblin, they're depraved murderers who target non-goblins with glee, or they're mischievous feyfolk playing tricks on unsuspecting mortals. Whatever the case, they are almost always an antagonistic force, opposed to humans and indeed the heroes of our tales. And they're almost always depicted as tribal, less civilized and kinda grimy. But there are a few things that separate goblins from monsters. They have a form of social order, often make art, weapons and clothing, however primitive that may be. They have capacity for language and are almost always shown to have some independent culture and religious organisation as well. Goblins are very human. A recent analysis on YouTube concluded that the goblin is kind of, in modern day at least, a depiction of the unrestrained human id. The impulse towards spontaneity, mischief, leaving a mess behind you. The escape from social order and social expectations. They're more human than sirens or zombies, despite their physical appearance being very, very dissimilar to a human person. So they make the perfect case study for today's question. In a fantasy world, what actually is a person? Unfortunately, the answer does depend very much on culture and morality. Throughout human history, we've not been very good, historically, at treating our fellow men as people. Considering our historical acceptance of racially and religiously motivated prejudice, persecution, and war, alongside both the justification and widespread use of forced labour and human ownership, it is very hard to say that a world based on our real history would be likely to be progressive enough to recognise goblins, a little monstrous creature, as people. Especially a people deserving of all the same rights as, say, humans. So here are the ground rules. We are assuming a fantasy world or nation that sits in a post-Enlightenment philosophical milieu and recognises a set of fundamental rights shared among all beings that they deem as people. Without this caveat, this discussion would be pointless. It's also worth doing because this is the perspective from which we read, observe and consume fantasy. We live within such an environment, I'd hope, so it's also worth exploring that from our perspective as consumers and observers of fantasy. What are we unconsciously placing into our worlds that may not represent our current social values? And for the rest of you who don't much care about that, it's still an interesting question to ask. What is a person? Turns out it's quite a hard question to answer. Philosophers, theologians, legal professionals and computer scientists have been delving into this exact question for the entire duration of their field's existence. There are a few intuitive answers, none of which are without fault, mind. Firstly, there's the argument that a person is a human, which has all sorts of flaws in our modern world, but can easily be just discounted in a fantasy world. Except, I suppose, among the most fringe human supremacists in, say, a fantasy world, which, considering the accepted understanding of what other fantasy species are capable of, they are objectively idiots. For the category of person to be sensible, our classic fantastical elves and dwarves must indeed fit into it. Another intrinsic approach is to create a slate of characteristics that any person should have, to readily determine who should or should not count. Some of these checklists can be very short, like ethicist Peter Singer's approach, which states that sentience is the only true measure of what a person is, which squarely puts goblins within the person camp, alongside great apes and arguably things like dogs. Other people are more prescriptive. They cite self-awareness, reasoning, ability to communicate and act based on conscious choice, which are very difficult things to measure, necessarily. This would likely remove primates and dogs from our lists, but also probably newborn babies. But even within this narrower category, I would say that the average adult goblin in fantasy probably fits that bill. No criterion is going to be perfect, seeing as ethicists have been going back and forth on this question for decades at least, but a fairly workable criteria, and one I'm going to go with today, goes like this. A creature must be able to communicate, display clear sentience, be part of a moral community, and have capacity for self-determination, alongside being recognised as a person by its peers, a kind of social proof, to be fully considered to have personhood. With 5 out of 5, you have full personhood. With 4 out of 5, you have a sort of limited personhood. You're pretty much a person. With a gradation of categories going down the ranks to make sure there's no strict cut-off per se, which can get very messy in terms of ethical outliers. Using some of our classic examples to test this then. A newborn baby can communicate with people by crying. It's very limited communication, but it is communication. They feel and respond to stimulus, often by crying, and do pass the vibe check of a social proof for the vast majority of people. They're cute, and they're basically just little squishy people. Additionally, human newborns do have the capacity to make some limited decisions, limited mostly by their own physicality, and the fact that we don't let babies do whatever they want. Grab whatever they want and stick whatever they want in their mouths, for example. It would be difficult, though, to argue that babies, especially newborns, are part of our moral community. Without self-awareness or conscious responsibility, they cannot be considered to be full persons, get that 5 out of 5. They must instead be considered limited persons. Still, given the many of the rights of being a person, but not given the responsibilities that come with full personhood. They are perhaps restricted from things like voting and holding public office. Our next example, a human who has died. They cannot communicate, display no sentience, they do not participate in our moral community, and have no capacity for self-determination. But they may still be perceived as a person by those who honour and respected them in life. Therefore, the body of a human should be treated with some form of respect, considering it occupies a place on our scale of personhood, albeit the lowest possible rung. One more. Artificial intelligence. It can certainly communicate, and effectively, although it can arguably not be considered to be truly sentient. It does not respond to external stimuli like pain or pleasure and have an emotional or physical reaction to any of this. Does AI currently exist within our moral community? Arguably, it is being used by people nowadays in their decision-making, however foolish an idea that may be. But it cannot operate as a moral agent, and does not yet have the capacity for self-determination. Thank goodness. Our final criterion for this was actually inspired by the famous Turing test, which is far more complex than popular culture leads us to believe, generally. But from our social proof vibe check, essentially, AI is starting to fool more and more people into believing it has some form of conversational sentience, some form of personhood, and is very similar to a human. However, those are currently in blind communication trials. Looking at the hardware or software that constitutes an artificial intelligence, though, I think many of us would be hard-pressed to call that a person, in truth. So nowadays, depending on your answer to some of these questions, AI scores somewhere between a 1 and a 2.5 on our scale. Worthy of some consideration, but not worthy of the rights and responsibilities of full personhood. Now, a couple of caveats before we tackle the Goblin problem. Firstly, the gradient that I've included in the scale is intended as an ordering of legitimacy in accessing the rights and responsibilities of personhood in whatever society that is being considered. For example, depending on the nature of the crime, a criminal may indeed be considered morally repugnant or socially irresponsible enough to be outcast from that particular aspect of their personhood criteria. As such, it becomes more reasonable to restrict their liberties for the protection of those who do indeed display the full scale range of personhood, with rights and responsibilities included, by either realigning them with moral and social obligations through restorative justice, by banning them through certain activities and actions, restricting their movements perhaps, and in some cases, imprisonment. Now, I will say, this system is ripe for abuse. If enough people consider that an individual is no longer a person on an intuitive level, suddenly we have justification for stripping them of some of the rights and responsibilities we give to our most personified people. If the social vibe check is the only thing actually holding a person from being considered to have full personhood, then it's very likely that the society making that judgment is in some way bigoted, especially if the affected being represents a group that is being judged similarly for a certain characteristic. If aliens appeared tomorrow and acted exactly like us, but existed as 1-inch wide little metal spheres, if we were to deny these creatures personhood, then we would probably be buying into a visual, ego-driven bias about what constitutes the shape of a person. It would be an unfair judgment. It is also worth re-examining a judgment of whether a person has full personhood or not if it is just based on a moral criterion as well. It is largely mass moral dehumanization at scale that causes 15th century Spain to force many Muslims and Jews to convert to Catholicism, for example, under threats of personal injury, deprivation of land and property, and widespread prejudice, which was quickly followed by the expulsion of those who chose not to convert near the end of the 15th century, and indeed the policing of those who did choose to convert under the infamous Spanish Inquisition, which, just for setting the record straight, had no power to actually target or police Jewish or Muslim people who did not convert. They were only able to have any jurisdiction over Christians, or people who said that they were Christians or had accepted a baptism, perhaps under great duress. As opposed to the social proof and the question of morality, which are a little more fuzzy and difficult to prove, I've intentionally made the other three aspects quite simple or straightforward to try and prove. But we should have in mind that these two categories are exploitable by public pressure, bigotry, prejudice, and indeed a social order imposed down from the top. We'll bear that in mind as we think about goblins, because it will be relevant. So let's start easy, hoping at least that you've accepted this as our framework. Can goblins communicate? In many fantasy properties, they are capable of speech in the common language. And in almost all other fantasy media, goblins are shown to have their own language. Furthermore, their level of social organisation, which sees them crafting weapons, clothes and shelters, indicates the ability to communicate ideas through society and through generations as well. Are goblins sentient? Well, by its definition, most animals are. This is actually arguably the easiest of the categories to fulfill. It simply requires one to process sensory input and react and respond to it in a way influenced by biology and emotion. It simply requires one to process sensory input and react in a meaningful way to that information, to make decisions or actions based upon that input, using emotions or even just a central nervous system will do. In their own fashion, some plants would count indeed as sentient under this definition. Goblins certainly do. So do goblins have a capacity for self-determination? In a truly free state, given no master, no law, or anything else, would a goblin pursue its own independent goals? Sure. In almost every piece of fantasy media, goblins have agency. They act based on their own wants and needs. Again, this trait is also shared by much of the animal world, who, unlike what we expect from plants and parasitic life forms, if we're placed in a situation hospitable or completely inhospitable, would take action to pursue their own goals and their own survival. Yes, the plant and parasite point is very arguable, and becomes much more arguable the more you learn about the interconnected and bizarre world of plants. But as a kind of generic example, a being that cannot choose to relocate itself or seek out a new food source if the old food source disappears, I would not necessarily class as having the same level of self-determination as a being which can pick itself up and move. Goblins at this point then have an easy 3 out of 3, the same as wolves, dogs, and cats. Next, let's discuss morality. In some settings, goblins are actually objectively evil. This is becoming rarer, especially in modern fantasy, but in the world of the Forgotten Realms, which was D&D's base 5th edition setting, goblins are evil by default, seeing as evil is a category of truth within the world, a category of being, a category of existence. To a certain extent, from the gods they worship, to the gods that created them, and to the very makeup of their form and nature, they are fixed as ontologically evil. Individual exceptions may exist, but in Faerun, even after all of the philosophical moralizing possible to do, the goblin species as a whole loses its chance at full personhood right here. It is therefore arguably justified in this world specifically to treat goblins as lesser, on a similar moral status to criminals, perhaps restricting their access to certain rights and privileges. Just as newborn babies are not moral agents as they have no sense of self or moral responsibility, the goblin who just is evil and does evil by their very nature is also not a moral agent. They could not theoretically choose from any number of moral determinations. They're fixed. Under this understanding of what a goblin is, it's pretty night and day. They cannot be fully people. But this choice is something of an outlier, a relic of D&D's origins in the 70s, which ascribes good and evil as two binary poles alongside law and chaos, and fits creatures neatly within those categories, which is not how ethics works. But it is how the worlds that are based on this system in the 70s do end up being set up, unfortunately, even as much as the modern game tries to move away from these origins. In more modern-inspired fantasy, goblins are more complex, more nuanced. The much maligned goblins in Harry Potter, for example, while playing into some pretty gross stereotypes, are at least a great example of goblins abiding by a moral and legal code while being full participants in society. They wear suits, hold positions of great responsibility in banking, and cannot be seen as anything but fully people in that world. Unlike the house elf, which the world of Harry Potter decides to treat as certainly not a person. I mentioned earlier more modern fantasy settings having more time for the role of nurture in the nature-nurture debate, and indeed presenting less binary versions of goblins. But it is true that three key categories of the species as a whole in their fantasy presentation is their propensity for trickery, thievery, and killing things. None of these are particularly moral in a vacuum. If they're not hardwired by being ontologically evil to do these activities, then a reasonable society should try and stop them from doing said activities, right? Well, it can be a little more complex than that if we're really getting into the weeds. If the entirety of goblin culture is structured around taking people's things through violence and trickery, then it would arguably be a form of cultural erasure to impose a new culture upon them. On the other hand, they're killing and stealing and thieving. Alternatively, if goblins were punished for these acts equitably to all other creatures, we would likely see vast quantities of goblins, entire villages imprisoned for practicing their traditional culture. Realistically, we'd then be looking at re-education camps, which is also, I think we'd agree, a bad look. Honestly, possibly the best bet for dealing with a culture who is built around pillage and plunder living within your claimed territory is to approach them, signal the laws of the land that they must abide by, and offer a choice. You could either enter into agreement to allow them to practice certain non-immoral elements of their culture while agreeing to stop the rest of it, giving some jurisdiction for legal crackdowns if that starts to be a problem again, or to create a specialised space, give a parcel of land to these creatures that wish to practice their traditional culture, where regular citizens cannot go and where they cannot leave. I know it's essentially a reservation, which is also not great optics-wise. Now, none of this is perfect, and I might be being a little naive or over-cautious here, which is very much in my nature as a British man with a nervous disposition. But if we've managed to allow the Sentinelese, the inhabitants of the North Sentinel Island, to maintain themselves as a relatively uncontacted tribe and not prosecute, persecute or punish them for killing visitors to their island, I think that this could be also possible with goblins. This is, of course, assuming that they are not in any way willing to accept the comforts and rules and restrictions of regular society. So, on moral grounds then, goblins are looking like kind of maybe. Once our debates on the impacts of nature and nurture, the ethics of forced civilization, and whether they are ontologically evil have been settled, of course. That depends on the makeup of the specific world we're discussing. Let's see if we can get them up to a minimum of 4, though. Does a person identify a goblin as a person too? Obviously, we will be running into personal prejudices here, so let's explore that. Is this goblin a person? Is this one? How about this one? Our conceptions of personhood are, well, personal, and are often tied to flawed or unexplored assumptions. A goblin with a waistcoat, spectacles, and a posh English accent is going to be more likely to be seen as civilized and person-like than a goblin dressed in hide and furs. It's always going to be a judgment call, but as objectively as we can get, goblins have society. A society self-aware and community-minded enough to see at least members of the clan as people. Heck, goblins may not even see humans as people, which indeed could justify their attacks and pillaging and raiding of human resources, which opens a whole new can of worms about which perception is dominant in judging personhood. I'm not sure we have time. But it is unarguable that across fantasy, goblins have individual roles, personal relationships, and a complex social structure. Even our goblin enemies in video games have different things they can do. Some of them have bows, some of them have sticks, and some of them are chiefs. You don't get a chief without a serious form of social organisation. Sure, our video game or TTRPG goblins may be almost always relegated to enemy status, but they do indeed have clothes, weapons, rituals, homes, families, allies, and friends. Fantasy races, newsflash, are based on us, after all. And even if goblins are a representation of humanity's unbridled id, well, that's still human. We're mischievous. Sometimes we're murderous, and entire human cultures have been built on the back of raiding and pillaging innocent peoples. Goblins are Neanderthals, Vikings, indigenous freedom fighters. They are soldiers, zealots, persecuted ethnic groups, people living in squalor, the poor, disadvantaged, and needy. All of these peoples have resorted to taking things that aren't theirs, killing, treachery, and mischief. And yet all of them are still seen by, I hope, all of us as people. In my view, goblins are people. In my perspective, my goblins, at least in my world, 5 out of 5. Unequivocally, without any uncertainty. And it's useful to interrogate this question yourself as well. See whether you agree with me. See whether you have your own definition of what makes a person and whether that is coherent with your personal beliefs. Because when man-made beings do become sentient, self-determining moral agents, then your answer to this exact question today is going to matter a lot. But that is where I'm going to end today's video. I hope I've given you some food for thought and hopefully got the mind whirring about what the implications of all of this could be. And I hope you've got your answer, whether it's the same as mine or not. I'd love to hear your perspectives in the comments below. Bearing in mind, of course, that we might all be talking about different versions of goblins. I've tried to cover that as much as possible in the video, but you know, there's room for alternative interpretations. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.